While Europe locks down even tighter, Britain is resisting for now, for pressure to abandon its plans to let people use their own judgment on how they spend Christmas. The UK government reveals its plans for an online harms bill and its plans for energy, and more people get cancelled, including Abraham Lincoln himself. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Christmas is coming. Are you excited? Did you get your turkey yet? Or your goose? Or nut roast? Whatever it was, I hope it wasn't too big, because we've been told by Prime Minister Boris Johnson to have ourselves a merry little Christmas. And by little, of course, he didn't really mean the size of a festive bird, but the number of family members who might gather together. But it's just advice. At the time of shooting this video anyway, it's down to you to use your common sense. Johnson said that he put the onus on individuals to exercise personal responsibility. Now, obviously, that will never do, and the government has been under pressure on all sides to slap down some new stringent restrictions. The leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, said that allowing Christmas mixing to go ahead would be the government's next big mistake. The editors of the British Medical Journal and the Health Service Journal did a joint editorial likewise saying that it was going to be a huge error. And people are saying, look at what's happening in Europe. Germany has implemented a hard lockdown over Christmas, which some are suggesting could last until Easter, as its hospital system is reported to be on the brink of overload. Since the country had a relatively light toll on the first wave, that does suggest that it perhaps has many more susceptible and vulnerable people, which could mean that the country has a horrid couple of months ahead during which it catches up with its neighbours. France, Italy, Belgium, all sorts of restrictions in place. And what's more, they say, look at Thanksgiving in the United States. Chris Hobson, chief executive of NHS Providers, which represents hospital trusts in England, said that in the US, cases, hospitalisations and deaths have jumped over the past fortnight, which is being described as the consequences of Thanksgiving. So with all this pressure, and with Johnson government's recent track record for U-turns as soon as there's some controversy, many have been expecting that the same would happen again quickly here, and Christmas would be cancelled. Well, not so far. There's lots of advice, but then you're advised to use your judgment. Think about whether it's a good idea for your elderly parents to visit you. Which is the sensible approach, you would think. Maybe one of those elderly parents isn't expected to see another year because they have other problems, so they would like to choose for themselves whether they spend their last Christmas with their family. And that is not a fictional scenario, by the way. Maybe both elderly parents already had COVID and came through it, so they're happy to take the risk. And maybe none of those apply, and so they will decide that it's best not to do it this year, rather than tie people up with rules that don't make sense. So people then break the rules and become lawbreakers by doing so, or else they inflict totally unnecessary misery on themselves by keeping the rules just for the sake of it. Give people information, give them strong advice for sure, and then let them use their own judgment. But what people ask about the idiots, people whose judgment is not to be trusted, well, those are the people who weren't going to obey the rules anyway. According to a YouGov poll, 1 in 4 people are prepared to break the rules over the holidays. The intended rule breaking in the majority of cases is said to be very slight. Unfortunately, the encouraging glimmer of allowing people free will for Christmas was rather dimmed by the parallel action of throwing a bunch more regions of the country into Tier 3 lockdown for the rest of the time. Tier 3 isn't a full lockdown, but it's more or less. But sooner or later, you do have to do this. What percentage of a population has to be vaccinated before you stop telling people how many people they can meet, who they can hug, and where they can go? Logically, once the most vulnerable people have been vaccinated, it comes down to deciding where the line gets drawn. The line cannot be that everyone's locked down until everyone has been vaccinated. Where do we think that line should be drawn? Shouldn't we be discussing that now? Now, of course, that in itself has led some to argue that being vaccinated should be compulsory. Since it's so important to what we do next, these crazy anti-vaxxers should be forced to do their bit, whether they want to or not. Luckily, we're still not that country. This week there was a debate in Parliament triggered by a petition. If you get more than 300,000 people to sign a petition, Parliament is obliged to debate it. And someone had put up a petition to prevent any restrictions on people who refuse a COVID-19 vaccination. This not only meant nobody should be forced to take the vaccine, but no company should be allowed to refuse service to someone based on their vaccination status. No freedom passports. The government minister, Nadim Zahawi, responding to the debate, stressed that the government opposed coercion and vaccine passports. It does feel as though the voices that have been raised over recent months against the massive restrictions on liberties have started to have some effect. Up until now, it has just been those shouting loudly that we should lock down faster and harder because otherwise people will die. You're just now starting to see some signs that we're realising the pendulum could actually come back a little bit. Maybe. The issue feels very close and personal for a lot of European leaders right now, since French President Emmanuel Macron tested positive for COVID-19 after he experienced mild symptoms. He'd met a bunch of high-ranking people over the last few days who now all have to isolate and keep their fingers crossed that they will be clear by Christmas. And he's not the only head of state feeling regretful right now. The King of Sweden, Carl Gustaf, said his country had failed to save lives with its chosen approach to coronavirus. The Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, agreed. To be fair, he probably wouldn't have felt that he could argue back even if he'd wanted to. Of course, the fact that so many have died can't be considered as anything other than a failure, he said. It's worth just reflecting on this. With the arrival of the vaccine, people think that the end is sort of in sight. But the coming winter months won't see any of those countries getting everyone vaccinated, so things are going to drag on. People that have been in prison testify that the absolute worst part of the experience are the weeks and months just before you know you're going to be released. At that point, release is so near but still not there. The whole thing begins to feel even more intolerable than it ever did before. We can bear that in mind personally. But also bear in mind, societies are going to be straining under the restrictions with increased vigour over the next couple of months. Expect to see many governments struggling to cope. Expect to see many moments of high tension and drama. It may feel at times over the next couple of months that it's all getting worse. Most likely it'll just be a sign that we're nearly at the end but not quite there yet, and people know it. All this will pass. Something to bear in mind over the holidays. Now, in a moment, we'll review some of the week's other news. But first, we know that persuasion is a part of life. If you go out on a first date or on a job interview, you're probably going to try to make a good first impression. Nobody would say that was wrong. You're not necessarily pretending to be something you're not. You're just trying to represent your best self to the other person. It's just marketing in another context. But it's hard to ignore that with the science of psychology being what it is, we now know an awful lot more about how to influence and persuade people without them even realising what we're doing. And we know that governments have started to take a solid interest in how this works. We talked last week about whether or not the UK government would be seeking to influence people, for instance, to eat less meat. How would they go about doing that? They would talk to their advisors, the group that started as the so-called Nudge Unit under David Cameron. That unit has been very active in working out what messages the government could use to get the maximum compliance with COVID-19 regulations. A lot of the messaging we've seen has been crafted by them to have the maximum impact. And by and large, it's worked, even within limits. Some of this we would accept if it was explained to us. For example, switching the previous process of opting into being an organ donor to one of being that you have to opt out from being an organ donor. Psychologically, people tend to just follow the default. So why not make the default the one that you want? That's fine. We can cope with that sort of example. But where's the line? The government thinks we should be less fat. The government thinks we should be more active. We probably think we should as well. But at what point does the government nudging us to do it stop being helpful and start being the sort of manipulation that has crossed a line? There's never been a time when there's been such an important question, because we're hovering on the edge of a world where government can define its role as being there to influence us for our own good on many issues all of the time. Now that feels like something we should talk about, and that's what I'll be covering in the next video on this channel. I'm not going to nudge you. You're going to have to decide for yourself to judge me for that discussion, going live here 7 p.m. UK time on Monday next week. So that's Monday 21st of December. See you then. This week, a number of people turned their mind once again to how should the internet be regulated, if indeed it should be at all. The UK government responded to consultations on its white paper, giving its intentions for a forthcoming online harms bill. We were told that the regulator Ofcom is to gain powers to block access to online services that fail to do enough to protect children and other users, which sounds obviously a good thing, although you start by asking for definitions of what constitutes harm and in the opinion of whom. Ofcom would be able to fine Facebook and others huge amounts and would require them to publish reports of their efforts to tackle posts that are harmful but not illegal. What could possibly go wrong? They point to harm such as promoting eating disorders and self-harm, but of course any new legislation they will always give the most obvious and compelling examples that no one's going to disagree with. You always have to ask, where is the line getting drawn? The elements of the law that have upset campaigners are that it specifically rules out introducing criminal prosecutions where executives would go to jail rather than simply companies receiving fines, and nor will it target online scams. But then there's also this question of fake news. The government response says this: the duty of care will apply to disinformation and misinformation that could cause harm to individuals, such as anti-vaccination content. The legislation will introduce additional provisions targeted at building understanding and driving action to tackle disinformation and misinformation. These provisions will include an expert working group which will build consensus and technical knowledge on how to tackle disinformation and misinformation. Now, the principle behind that misinformation that could directly cause harm is one that you could support in theory. In practice, we have seen too many examples already of expert bodies and companies as well, by the way, casting a massively wide net over what does and doesn't count as misinformation likely to cause harm. Leftist identity politics campaigners claim that all sorts of things, arguments about science or policy, can make them feel that they have been harmed or at least feel unsafe. When language is being used so loosely, I'm not sure that we trust working groups to come up with a good definition of what is or is not misinformation. Bearing in mind, the process becomes available to all subsequent governments to put their own definitions into play. Now, expect all of these issues to come back into the spotlight once this turns into actual legislation before Parliament next year. And it's been a busy week for legislative promises, since the government also released its energy white paper, detailing how it intends to go about expanding wind power, creating a new hydrogen infrastructure, investing in electric charging for vehicles, and snailing forward on new nuclear power. Environmentalists have been complaining loudly about the nuclear component of that because they hate nuclear power. But also on hydrogen, Friends of the Earth said this: 99% comes from fossil fuels. Splitting gas to make hydrogen emits CO2. The article the tweet linked to basically complains about hydrogen because existing oil and gas companies are involved and they're bad. If you want any indication that environmentalists are counting themselves out of being part of a solution, this is the perfect example. On the one hand, they'll say there's a climate crisis. We use the word crisis because we have to start behaving like it's a crisis, which is fine. I mean, I don't use the word crisis myself. It's a case you can make. But then in the next breath, they say, but we don't like nuclear. Oh, and we don't like hydrogen. And even if it's a crisis, we're not going to listen to any arguments that suggest that things we don't like might be necessary. Their problem is that a Conservative government, the thing that they hate the most, has put forward an ambitious and practical programme for energy change. Now, it is by far not perfect. It could do with some effective opposition to hold it to account and to sharpen it up, but the environmentalists have nothing to offer. Their alternatives are not based on reality, not based on an analysis of the energy mix and what needs to be done in order to make it work the way that they would prefer. So their voice is going to count for nothing going forward. If you're not prepared to put in the work, that's what happens. Deservedly. And it's something you need to get right. China is apparently being struck by widespread electricity blackouts and restrictions as it goes into an early winter cold spell. Some have been speculating that part of the reason might be because of the country's ban on importing Australian coal, following its call for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Residents of Hunan and Zhejiang have been issued notices to restrict energy use, and Chinese social media users have been complaining on the effects of resulting power outages. A spokesperson for the Changsha Power Supply Company said that problems in Hunan were partly down to the early onset of cold and partly due to a drop in energy production capacity, which included the reduction of coal burning, a decline in reservoir water levels, and the inability of wind power to generate electricity because of freezing temperatures. In November, coal imports were down by 2 million tonnes to just under 12 million. And although coal use is planned to begin to decline in China, it remains the major part of the energy mix today. Now, it's possible that the Australia coal ban is part of the reason. And let's face it, the Chinese leadership are never going to admit such a thing, so it will be impossible to ever know for sure. It is at least an indicator that a China which has been increasingly ready to arguably bully other countries that have a major trading relationship with it isn't immune to suffering self-inflicted impacts as a result. That might be something that will be an advantage to the United States, as its new government ramps up its focus on both climate change and competition with China in the new year. So you'd hope that President-elect Joe Biden would be hiring good people able to take forward that serious work. And maybe he is, but right now it is still the case that overwhelmingly all we're hearing about is that he's hired a black one and 2 brown ones and a gay one and one with female genitalia. So, for instance, he just hired Michael Regan to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. He's currently Secretary for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Apparently, Mary D. Nichols of California had been seen as the front runner. But according to the New York Times, liberal groups accused her of not doing enough to address issues of environmental racism. It said Biden has been under pressure as well to make his picks even more racially diverse. So, woohoo, a black one. If he is a highly talented leader, how does he feel, I wonder? Feeling that he got picked because he's black? And because the radical liberals don't accuse him of institutional racism, which is nice of them. Do we think that he would be disappointed if the focus had been on his many achievements instead, and that maybe those were why he got the job? Former primary candidate Pete Buttigieg was given the transport brief, thereby becoming the first cabinet-level out gay man. He's had no involvement with transport issues, but apparently has a great fondness for public transport in his youth. So that's all right. If you were looking for early indicators on how things are going to play out, I'm not sure that these are hopeful ones. As I said before, hopefully all these people are going to rise to the challenge and are excellent at their jobs. But if that happens, you got lucky, because this is not the process to choose them. If you're not choosing people on talent and track record alone, then history suggests you won't get the best people. In other news, Julie Burchell's forthcoming book on cancel culture got cancelled. Literally cancelled, although no doubt another publisher will pick it up in due course. She got into a Twitter spat with someone and pointed out that one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad was a child, which is factually true. It's not entirely obvious how it was relevant to the argument she was having at the time, but no doubt it made sense in her mind. Still shouldn't have been cancelled. Also, Abraham Lincoln was cancelled. It had to happen eventually. The Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco is looking at changing its name because the 16th president didn't demonstrate that Black lives mattered to him. He just liberated them from slavery, whereas he should have been appointing them to his government regardless of their suitability. So who's left? Because, as we know, No historical figure can pass the purity test, so it's just a matter of time. I'm not even sure that anybody is left once you've dispatched Lincoln. Around 2019 was when we realised that nobody alive is pure enough to host the Oscars. And in 2020, we've realised that nobody in history was pure enough to merit a statue. So 2021, what you got for us? In a moment, we'll respond to some comments and the thought for the week. But first, I couldn't help but notice it's Christmas next Friday. I know, I'd forgotten all about it. So I'm not promising a video for Wednesday. Instead, the roundup video will move from Friday to Thursday because probably most of you won't be thinking about watching my videos on YouTube as your chosen way of spending Christmas. I mean, I'm gutted personally, but I'll just have to cope with the snub. Over the following week, there won't be any of the heavily researched videos, but I'm minded to do a few seasonal short videos with some ideas, some thoughts, some reflections. And then we hit 2021 running with the first roundup video of the year on Friday as normal. What more could you ask for? Before I respond to a couple of comments that people have left this week, just a quick heads up for my active commenters. YouTube has stepped up its interventions for comments that cross the line into abusive language. I think because lots of creators really struggle with such abuse, YouTube is now being much more proactive about filtering out and holding for approval comments that its algorithm detects as using bad language, which means the channel owner has to actively approve it for it to go live. Oh, and because some channel owners get stressed if they even see a badge indicating a number of comments that are waiting for approval, they don't show that either. So it's possible for someone like me to completely forget to check because there's no visual indicator. And it does change the dynamic for me a bit. Whereas before I generally had a very light hand on removing comments unless they were bullying new or less confident commenters. Now, if you post something with abusive language, for me to click the button to actually make that appear, that's me being proactive, putting it there. And I'm less inclined to do that sometimes. Just like my first promo, it's changed my default. If there's a comment with some real substance and it's just got some abuse thrown in to me or to someone who's very used to taking it, who gives as good as they get, then I'm sure I'm still going to... But if it's over the top, if it's just abuse, why would I be proactive and say, oh yes, I'm going to make this abuse appear? So look, the point is this. If you want to enjoy having vigorous debates and discussions on here, you will get the least interference from YouTube if you just don't stick in the expletives. I thought I would give you a heads up that that had changed. All right, 2 quick comments. As humans, we are compelled to believe in something. We crave a higher belief system, something to aspire to. As the West trends away from Christianity, something must fill this gap. Nietzsche called this movement enlightenment. One of the things people have latched onto as substitute for Christianity is global warming. Do we all have a God-shaped hole in our being? And if so, what do we fill it with? That is a much longer discussion. Is it the case that people have replaced Christianity with global warming? Well, maybe. The minority who have turned the protesting of it into a lifestyle, the people who will sincerely preach zero carbon by 2025, which is no more fantastical than believing in the virgin birth, I suppose. Some of the people who put this forward imply that all people who accept the climate research must fall into this category. And I'm pretty sure that's not right. I think the distinction is this. Some people are angry when I've done videos on here showing the actual research that disproves some of the extreme fears. If your response to good news is anger or disappointment, then you are maybe in the category of seeking religion. The majority of the people would still like all the good news they can get because they have other things in life that they'd like to focus on. Okay, then I had this one on the Great Barrier Reef video. Another good video, thanks. Perhaps it could have been mentioned that many of the studies showing that there is a crisis of failed replication. In fact, the replication crisis in academia is well worth a video on its own. Yes, indeed. It's an area that I certainly find interesting, and you can take it that you might well be seeing a video on that early in 2021. Some people think that it simply means they can dismiss any and all research that comes to conclusions that they don't like. Obviously, there's rather more substance to be discovered on the topic than that. I think it'll be interesting. We'll come to it. Sometime in the next few days, and possibly already by the time you watch this, Britons will learn whether or not we leave the EU with or without a trade deal. Now, I've almost never covered that issue here because it's mostly been a never-ending stream of negotiations dragging on, bluff and counter-bluff, brag and counter-brag, and although the political writers go on endlessly about the minutiae of every step of the way, I just don't find that very interesting. But now that the negotiations are more or less down to one key issue, fishing, there have been some exchanges I thought were worth commenting on because they rather illustrate the whole underlying difference in perspective that led to the whole thing. On the one side, people say that the value of the fishing industry to the UK economy is tiny, and you don't want the whole important deal to go up in smoke because of fishing. Chris Giles, the economics editor of the Financial Times, pointed out, for instance, that the Harrods store in London contributes more value to the economy than the entire fishing industry. Meanwhile, the people on the other side say that it's not about the size of the pie, it's about the principle that as a separate sovereign nation, Britain has control of its own waters. Taking back control as a nation was, after all, the whole point. And right there you have Brexit encapsulated. For the Remainers, it was a question of economic benefits, a transactional relationship. For the Leavers, it was about national identity. National identity doesn't look at the sums. It's a powerful sense of who you are as a people. So long as you miss the power of that basic human principle, you're going to lose the argument. You can see the same dynamics playing out when it comes to the possible future Scottish referendum. Brits will probably point to all the economic problems Scotland will have on its own, which are very real. And the Scottish nationalists will say, no matter, they will be our problems, not yours. Unless you've built a cohesive identity, you have nothing to counter that with. In 2012, around the time of the Olympics in London, it felt like we did have that cohesiveness around the sense of the United Kingdom. Doesn't feel like it now. And the fact that COVID lockdown policies have been differently implemented in each of the four nations has kind of underlined the point psychologically. Some people have spent a lot of time imagining globalist conspiracies around the World Economic Forum, but the truth is the globalist vision has been pushed back. Nationalism in its broadest sense has been resurgent. Nobody now thinks a global government could work. The institutions of global governance, the United Nations, are more under attack for their lack of effectiveness and their corruption than they've ever been before. Even the federal centre of the United States is under greater stress than it's been since the Civil War. And it's the same thing, because two political traditions have sharply diverged into two separate and incompatible visions of what national identity means. The EU is showing signs of its own problems to come, with some positing a reinvention of the bloc without the Eastern European powers. And yet, while all of this is going on, we still have a more interconnected world through trade and travel than we've ever had, and we face genuinely global problems. The decade of the 2020s is surely going to be about how this dynamic between national identity and global problem solving finds a new balance, or doesn't. Maybe the early feedback we get on how Brexit goes on the subject of fish will give us an early indicator of how it's going to go in the bigger picture. And that's a question that'll probably be out of date as soon as this video is uploaded, possibly even before. Luckily, my ability to produce these videos is not dependent on the outcome of Brexit. To some extent, it's dependent on the vagaries of YouTube, and who knows how that will go in 2021, with all the pressures on content that tries to ask difficult questions. For that reason, I've started uploading these videos also to the alternative video service Rumble. It's a bit clunky as a platform, but probably less so than the other alternatives at the current point in time. At least it means that if any of these videos should suffer the same fate as those ones by Thunderfoot and Rationality Rules that we talked about last week, where they were taken down by YouTube without explanation, at least I'll be able to point to a place where you can see them. It's the support of good people on Patreon that means that I can and will continue to make videos on all subjects that I think are important here, regardless of whether that means they get demonetized or whatever worse that YouTube can think of. It enables me to put in the time that it takes to produce 3 videos or more per week, even though a number of them require quite a bit of time and research. So, if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please consider signing up at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. Heck, have a great Christmas. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.